In the isolated hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, 1876, where cabins stood miles from the nearest soul, two sisters earned the trust of every traveler who passed through. The story I'm about to tell begins with women known as healers, midwives who delivered hope to desperate families. But when men began vanishing from the roads near their homestead, and the sisters appeared repeatedly pregnant with no husbands to name, whispers turned to horror. What investigators finally discovered buried beneath their property, hidden in ledgers written in their own hand, revealed practices so disturbing that seasoned lawmen refused to document the full truth for decades. How did respected healers conceal such darkness? What drove them to transform travelers seeking shelter into something unspeakable? And what kind of justice could answer for crimes this profane? Prepare yourself for what comes next, because the evidence will leave you shaken. Devil's Fork Road earned its name long before the Penlow sisters made it infamous. The rutted path wound through dense Ozark forest where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy even at midday, connecting isolated homesteads to the trading posts of Thayer and Alton. In 1876, travelers who braved this route did so out of necessity, not choice. The road was known for its silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional call of crows that seemed to follow lone riders with unnatural persistence. Martha and Eliza Penlow lived in a sagging homestead 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, daughters of Reverend Silas Penlow, a preacher defrocked for heresy in 1859. The sisters, aged 37 and 32 respectively, had built reputations as healers and midwives throughout Oregon County. Their cabin was surrounded by carefully tended herb gardens and drying racks hung with medicinal plants, but also with animal bones arranged in patterns that made visitors uneasy. Locals described them as strange but God-fearing women who quoted Scripture with the authority of preachers and offered remedies that saved children from fever and mothers from childbed death. This trust, carefully cultivated over years, became their greatest weapon. In the spring of 1876, a traveling tinker named Eli Braden stopped at the Penlow homestead seeking supper and shelter. The 29-year-old German-born tool seller was known along his route as honest and hard-working, a man who sang while he worked and wrote faithful letters to his wife. He was last recorded in a store ledger at Greer's Mill, purchasing nails and flour before heading toward Devil's Fork Road. He never arrived at his next destination. 3 days later, his horse was found wandering near 11 Point River, its bit rain-cut clean with a blade. The saddlebags remained intact, personal belongings untouched, but Braden himself had vanished as completely as smoke. Local authorities initially assumed bandits had struck, a common enough occurrence in the lawless post-war Ozarks, where Confederate bushwhackers still prowled remote areas. Sheriff James Holloway, a 44-year-old Civil War veteran known for methodical investigation, noted the disappearance in his field journal but found no evidence of robbery or struggle. The case went cold as winter approached, and the roads became impassable. But in August of 1876, another man disappeared. Josiah Maris, a 41-year-old mule driver and former Union teamster, was last seen sharing supper at the Penlow cabin during a rainstorm. Witnesses at a nearby trading post recalled both sisters purchasing an unusual quantity of lye and lamp oil the following week, enough to preserve meat for months. By spring of 1877, 2 more men had vanished after being seen near the Penlow property. The pattern was unmistakable to Sheriff Holloway, who began keeping detailed records of each disappearance. Every victim was traveling alone. Every man was last seen within miles of the sisters' cabin, and every disappearance occurred during months when the sisters claimed to be hosting travelers seeking refuge. The sheriff's log from April 18th of 77 records his first visit to the homestead, noting with understated alarm that both women denied seeing any recent visitors, yet the house reeked of lye and smoke strong enough to burn the eyes. More disturbing was his observation about meat smoking in the outdoor pit, described in his careful handwriting as too pale for pork, too large for deer. That same month, a teenage farmhand named Caleb Dern reported seeing the sisters bathing in a creek near their property with men's coats laid on the bank nearby. The 17-year-old boy, son of a local homesteader, was known for honesty despite his fear of what he called haints. His statement, recorded in Sheriff Holloway's journal on July 8, 1877, described coats of different sizes and colors, suggesting multiple men. 2 weeks later, those same coats were recovered from the creek bed, their pockets emptied, but still bearing the marks of travel, stained with dried blood that had resisted the water's attempts to wash it clean. The investigation took a darker turn when bones surfaced downstream in June of 1877, stripped clean and boiled white. Dr. Charles Albright, a 52-year-old physician educated in St. Louis, examined the remains and identified them as human femurs, not livestock, as the sisters had claimed when questioned. The bones showed evidence of deliberate processing, boiled in lye to remove flesh efficiently. Inside the Penlow cabin, a visiting midwife named Agnes Poole discovered infant clothing stitched from men's shirts, the fabric still bearing monograms and buttons that belonged to no one in the isolated community. When she reported this to Sheriff Holloway in January of 1878, the pieces began forming a picture too horrifying for most to accept. The whispers began slowly at first, spreading through Oregon County like poison, seeping into groundwater. By February of 1878, locals openly discussed what they had been too frightened to name. The sisters were not simply strange, they were something far worse. The evidence Agnes Poole brought to Sheriff Holloway proved impossible to dismiss. The infant clothing she had seen in the Penlow cabin was not merely repurposed fabric, but deliberate construction using shirts that matched descriptions of garments worn by missing men. One particular piece, a small gown stitched from blue chambray, bore part of a monogram that matched letters found in Eli Braden's recovered saddlebags. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the timing. Both Martha and Eliza had appeared pregnant multiple times over the past 3 years, yet no husbands were ever named, no fathers acknowledged. When neighbors asked, the sisters claimed divine providence or spiritual conception, quoting twisted scripture that blended their father's heretical teachings with their own invented theology. Local midwives who assisted with births reported that the infants rarely survived more than weeks. Yet no graves could be found on the property. No burial records existed in any church registry. The babies simply disappeared, as completely as the men who had stopped seeking shelter at the isolated homestead. Sheriff Holloway's field notes from March of 1878 reveal his growing certainty that the sisters were not merely concealing crimes, but actively participating in them. His entry dated March 2nd describes finding a silver pocket watch buried beneath loose floorboards in the smokehouse, a structure built behind the main cabin where meat was preserved. The watch was engraved with initials E.B., matching Eli Braden perfectly. More damning was its condition, still functional, wound recently, suggesting it had been kept as a trophy rather than sold for profit. Holloway noted in his journal that the watch's placement, deliberately hidden beneath a specific board that required tools to access, indicated premeditation and careful concealment. The breakthrough came when a local farmer, clearing land adjacent to the Penlow property, discovered bones protruding from eroded soil near the creek bank. Dr. Albright was summoned to examine the remains, and his findings, documented in a report dated March 7, 1878, confirmed what Holloway had suspected. The bones were human, male, and showed evidence of deliberate dismemberment. More disturbing were the tool marks visible on several specimens, parallel grooves consistent with a saw or heavy knife, suggesting systematic butchering rather than disposal. Albright's careful measurements and anatomical sketches provided the first concrete forensic evidence linking the sisters to murder. Community fear transformed into rage when Circuit Judge Samuel Pickett arrived in Oregon County to review the mounting evidence. Relatives of missing travelers had filed petitions in Howell County Court, documented in Docket 1127, State v. Penlow, demanding investigation into the disappearances. The judge ordered Sheriff Holloway to conduct a full excavation of the Penlow property, with particular attention to the smokehouse and surrounding grounds. What began as legal procedure became an archaeological nightmare as investigators uncovered layer after layer of hidden horror. The excavation commenced on March 15, 1878, with Sheriff Holloway leading a team of 6 men through the property. Beneath the smokehouse floor, buried in shallow pits lined with lime, they discovered 3 male skulls, each showing identical trauma patterns at the base where skull met spine. Dr. Albright's examination revealed blunt force impact consistent with a hammer or similar tool, delivered with enough force to kill instantly. The skulls had been cracked post-mortem, deliberately broken to extract contents in a manner that suggested ritual rather than simple disposal. Intermingled with the adult remains were smaller bones, infant-sized, creating a charnel pit that defied rational explanation. The true scope of the sisters' depravity emerged when investigators found a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a loose hearthstone in the main cabin. The book, written in Eliza's careful hand, listed names and dates spanning from 1873 to 1878. Each entry followed a disturbing pattern, a man's name or description, followed by the date he arrived at the homestead, then a second date marked with the word conception beside it. The final column listed outcomes, most marked simply as taken or offerings complete. The ledger contained 14 entries, suggesting far more victims than the 6 men officially reported missing. Each page provided documentary evidence of planning, tracking, and deliberate selection of targets. Dr. Albright's expanded coroner report, filed March 19, 1878, detailed findings that shocked even hardened lawmen. Physical evidence recovered from the victims showed they had been struck from behind, killed quickly and efficiently before any struggle could occur. But more disturbing were traces of biological material found on several remains, evidence that suggested the sisters had engaged in acts with the corpses following death. The doctor's clinical language barely concealed the horror of what he documented: carnal contact with deceased victims, conception through means that violated both moral law and natural order. When confronted with the evidence, Martha offered a partial confession that revealed the twisted theology driving their actions. According to Sheriff Holloway's transcript, dated March 21, 1878, she claimed they did as the spirits directed to conceive pure seed untainted by local men. Her words, recorded verbatim, described a belief system inherited from their father's ruined sermons, a conviction that conception through blood sacrifice produced angel-born children immune to sin and corruption. The confession provided motive but offered no remorse, only cold certainty that divine will justified their actions. The full excavation of the smokehouse pit revealed horrors that would haunt Oregon County for generations. Over 3 days in late March of 1878, Sheriff Holloway's team unearthed remains that transformed suspicion into undeniable proof of systematic murder. The pit itself was approximately 8 feet deep and lined with stones, constructed with the same careful attention the sisters applied to their herb gardens. Each layer revealed new evidence, carefully buried and preserved with lime and lye to slow decomposition. Dr. Albright worked methodically through the remains, documenting every bone fragment, every scrap of clothing, every personal item that could identify victims or establish timeline. The 3 skulls found initially were only the beginning. Deeper excavation uncovered partial skeletal remains from at least 3 additional male victims, their bones scattered and incomplete, suggesting the sisters had moved or relocated evidence over time. Each skull showed identical trauma patterns, a single devastating blow to the base where the skull connected to the spine, delivered with precision that indicated experience and repetition. Dr. Albright's report, filed March 23, 1878, noted that the angle and force of impact suggested victims were struck while kneeling or bent forward, likely while removing boots or preparing to sleep. The sisters had perfected an efficient method of killing that gave victims no opportunity to fight back or cry for help. Most disturbing were the infant bones discovered intermingled with adult remains, tiny femurs and skulls no larger than apples scattered throughout the pit like broken pottery. Dr. Albright counted remains from at least 7 infants, though the fragmentary nature of the evidence made exact numbers impossible to determine. Several of the infant skulls showed abnormalities consistent with inbreeding or genetic defects, suggesting the sisters' twisted theology had produced offspring damaged by their unnatural conception. The doctor's notes described malformed bone structure, incomplete skull plates, and developmental abnormalities that would have made survival unlikely, even with medical intervention unavailable in the isolated Ozarks. The ledger found beneath the hearthstone provided the prosecutorial framework that would later secure convictions. Each entry contained dates that could be cross-referenced with reported disappearances, creating an unbroken chain of evidence linking the sisters to specific victims. The entry for Eli Braden read, E.B. Tinker, arrived April 9th, conception April 10th, taken April 12th. The dates aligned perfectly with witness statements placing Braden at the homestead and the subsequent discovery of his horse. Similar entries matched Josiah Maris and 2 other identified victims, providing documentary proof of premeditation and systematic execution. The ledger's existence proved these were not crimes of passion or spontaneous violence, but calculated acts repeated over years with careful record-keeping. Investigators discovered additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of the sisters' practices. Hidden in the cabin cellar, behind stacks of preserved food, they found a collection of men's personal belongings, pocket watches, belt buckles, spectacles, a knife monogrammed TL, and various tools that traveling men would have carried. Each item was cleaned and carefully stored, suggesting the sisters kept trophies from their victims. Among these artifacts was a tobacco case engraved J.M., belonging to Josiah Maris, and a set of Tinker's tools that matched descriptions from Eli Braden's wife. The collection represented at least 9 different men, more victims than the 6 officially documented in missing persons reports. The most chilling discovery came when investigators found a glass jar preserved in the cellar's coolest corner, containing a fetus suspended in alcohol. The jar's label, written in Eliza's hand, bore only the initials E.B. Dr. Albright's examination suggested the fetus was approximately 4 months developed when preserved, consistent with the timeline between Eli Braden's disappearance and when Eliza would have been visibly pregnant. The preservation itself indicated planning and intention, as if the sisters viewed their offspring as sacred artifacts worthy of keeping rather than burying with the father's remains. This single piece of evidence became the most powerful symbol of the sisters' depravity, physical proof of conception following murder. Martha's diary, discovered sewn into the lining of her mattress, provided written confession that complemented the physical evidence. Entries dating back to 1873 described her beliefs in language that mixed scripture with original theology. One passage read, "Each man was chosen, his strength taken into me. Those who came seeking warmth fed the fire below. The fire she referenced was both literal, the smokehouse where bodies were processed, and spiritual, her belief that male essence transferred through ritualized acts could produce divinely conceived children. Another entry detailed her conviction that local men were tainted by sin and war, unsuitable for producing the pure lineage their father's prophecies demanded. Only strangers, men untouched by the corruption of settled communities, could provide appropriate seed for their sacred purpose. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Dr. Albright completed his comprehensive analysis of all remains and submitted his final coroner's report on March 29, 1878. The document, preserved in Missouri State Archives Box 4B, detailed findings that left no room for alternative explanations. All male victims died from blunt force trauma to the base of the skull delivered by a hammer or similar implement. Post-mortem examination of bone showed evidence of carnal violation following death, biological traces that confirmed the sisters' own confessions about their practices. The infant remains showed genetic abnormalities consistent with conception between closely related parents or through severely compromised biological material. Every piece of evidence pointed to deliberate, repeated, ritualized murder, followed by acts that defied civilized comprehension. Sheriff Holloway's final inventory of evidence, compiled April 1, 1878, listed over 40 separate items: bones, personal effects, written confessions, witness statements, and forensic analyses. Each piece corroborated the others, creating an evidentiary web so tight that defense would prove impossible. The case represented one of the earliest examples of systematic forensic investigation in rural Missouri, where physical evidence and documentation combined to establish guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Justice was no longer a matter of speculation or moral certainty, but of documented fact recorded in official records that would survive for future generations. The arrest of Martha and Eliza Penlow on April 2, 1878, required careful planning and overwhelming force. Sheriff Holloway, aware of the sisters' reputation for herbal knowledge and the community's superstitious fear, assembled a team of 6 armed men to accompany him to the isolated homestead. The approach was made at dawn, when the sisters would be least prepared for confrontation. As the lawmen emerged from the tree line, they found both women standing in the doorway as if expecting their arrival, Martha's face set in grim determination, while Eliza wept silently. The sheriff's journal entry for that morning noted an unnatural stillness about the property, no birdsong or animal sounds, as if even nature had withdrawn from the evil that saturated the land. Martha refused to surrender peacefully, barricading herself inside the cabin while Eliza stood frozen on the porch. According to witness statements recorded in the arrest report, Martha screamed curses through the closed door, her voice alternating between her own and what several men swore sounded like a man's deeper register speaking words in no recognizable language. The standoff lasted 3 hours before Holloway's men forced entry through a rear window. They found Martha standing over an open cellar door, holding a hammer identical to the weapon Dr. Albright had identified as the murder instrument. Her hands were stained with what appeared to be fresh blood, though later investigation revealed she had cut her own palms in some final ritualistic act. The cellar itself revealed horrors that had escaped initial investigation. The door had been barred from the outside with heavy timber, suggesting it served purposes beyond simple storage. Inside, investigators discovered 2 shallow graves recently excavated, the earth still loose and dark. Beside these empty pits stood what witnesses described as a birthing altar, a flat stone approximately 4 feet long, elevated on smaller rocks and stained with biological residue. Dr. Albright's later analysis of material scraped from the stone's surface confirmed presence of both adult and infant blood, some deposits years old based on oxidation patterns. The altar's placement directly above the grave suggested the sisters performed their perverted birthing rituals over the very ground where they intended to bury the resulting offspring. During transport to the Oregon County Jail, Eliza began speaking in broken sentences about the unborn child she carried, claiming it was the last offering and would speak for them when born. The county jail log, maintained by Deputy Marshal Thomas Greer, documented her behavior over the following days. She refused all food, spending nights whispering to her swollen belly and singing hymns in a voice that other prisoners described as unsettling in its childlike sweetness. Medical examination by Dr. Albright confirmed she was approximately 7 months pregnant, though he noted abnormalities in the pregnancy that suggested severe complications. His report, filed April 5th, recommended she be monitored closely as both mother and child appeared in distress. Martha's behavior provided stark contrast to her sister's deterioration. She remained silent and defiant, speaking only to quote Scripture or proclaim that the Lord takes his tithe. When questioned about specific victims, she showed no remorse, instead expressing satisfaction that she had fulfilled divine mandate. Sheriff Holloway's interrogation notes from April 7th record her statement that each man came of his own will, seeking comfort, and that their sacrifice purified fallen seed into sacred lineage. Her cold rationality proved more disturbing than Eliza's emotional collapse, suggesting complete conviction in the righteousness of her actions despite overwhelming evidence of depravity. As news of the arrest spread through Oregon County and beyond, public outrage reached levels that threatened lynch mob violence. Citizens from Thayer, Alton, and as far as Springfield demanded immediate execution without trial. Reverend Amos Lyle, the 63-year-old circuit preacher whose initial warnings had spurred investigation, worked to maintain order through daily sermons emphasizing that justice must be achieved through law rather than vengeance. His church ledger from April 1878 contains entries describing his efforts to prevent vigilante action, noting that evil cannot be defeated by embracing evil methods. His moral authority kept angry citizens from storming the jail, though armed guards remained posted throughout the sisters' incarceration. The Springfield Republican newspaper, in editions published throughout April of 1878, dubbed Martha and Eliza the devil midwives of the Ozarks, a name that captured public imagination and spread their infamy beyond Missouri. Articles detailed the evidence discovered at their homestead, though editors felt compelled to omit the most disturbing details as unsuitable for family readership. The newspaper coverage served dual purpose, satisfying public demand for information while building pressure on the legal system to deliver swift and certain punishment. By late April, the case had become the most widely discussed criminal matter in Missouri since the James Younger Gang's activities, though the nature of the Penlow crimes proved far more disturbing than simple banditry. On April 28th, the eve of preliminary hearings, Martha attempted suicide using lye smuggled into her cell through means never determined. Deputy Greer discovered her convulsing on the cell floor, her mouth and throat burned from swallowing the caustic substance. Dr. Albright was summoned immediately and managed to save her life through aggressive treatment, though the damage to her esophagus left her barely able to speak. The jail log notes that she survived long enough to give a final written statement, painfully scrawled with trembling hand, declaring that the child will speak for us when born. This cryptic message, preserved in court records, suggested she believed Eliza's pregnancy would somehow vindicate their actions or prove divine approval of their methods. The physical evidence continued mounting even during incarceration. Investigators conducting final searches of the property discovered additional personal items buried in the herb garden, including a wedding ring engraved with a date from 1868 and a military identification disc from a Union soldier. These artifacts suggested the sisters' activities might have begun years before the documented disappearances, possibly as early as the immediate post-war period when displaced soldiers and refugees wandered the Ozarks in large numbers. Each new discovery expanded the potential victim count and deepened public horror at the scope of crimes that had occurred undetected for perhaps a decade or more on that isolated Devil's Fork Road property. The trial of Martha and Eliza Penlow commenced in Greene County Court on June 3, 1878, drawing spectators from across Missouri and beyond. Judge Samuel Pickett presided over proceedings that would last 12 days, presenting evidence so comprehensive and disturbing that several jurors requested relief from duty, but were denied. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Harold Westmore, built their case on the foundation of physical evidence, witness testimony, and the sisters' own written confessions. Court transcripts, preserved in Record Volume 4 of 1878, document every piece of evidence presented, creating a historical record of justice methodically pursued despite public calls for immediate execution. The prosecution's opening statement laid out charges of 4 counts of murder, desecration of corpses, and occult practices, though evidence suggested far more victims than could be definitively proven. Attorney Westmore presented Dr. Albright's coroner reports first, establishing cause of death for each identified victim through detailed forensic analysis. The doctor testified for 6 hours, describing skull fractures, tool marks on bones, and biological evidence that confirmed post-mortem violations. His clinical testimony, delivered without emotion or embellishment, proved more effective than dramatic rhetoric could have achieved. Jurors examined actual skulls recovered from the smokehouse pit, passing the evidence hand to hand, while Martha watched with cold indifference and Eliza wept continuously. Witness testimony painted a picture of trusted community members who weaponized that trust for evil purposes. Agnes Poole described discovering infant clothing sewn from men's shirts, her voice breaking as she recounted feeling honored to assist healers while unknowingly standing steps from buried victims. Caleb Dern testified about seeing the sisters with men's coats, his youthful face pale as he pointed to Martha, and identified her as the woman who had stared at him with such malevolence that he fled without confronting her. Sheriff Holloway presented his field journal, reading entries that documented the investigation's progression from suspicion to certainty. His testimony regarding the silver pocket watch found beneath the smokehouse floor proved particularly damning, as Eli Braden's widow confirmed the engraving and provided letters her husband had written days before his disappearance. The ledger discovered beneath the hearthstone became the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Attorney Westmore read entries aloud, matching names and dates to missing persons reports filed by desperate families. Each entry followed the same chilling pattern: arrival date, conception date, disposition. The courtroom fell silent as he read Martha's own words, documenting systematic selection and murder of travelers who sought nothing more than shelter and a warm meal. The ledger's meticulous record-keeping transformed the sisters from women driven by madness into calculating predators who planned and executed murders with businesslike efficiency over a span of at least 5 years. The defense, appointed by the court as the sisters could afford no counsel, attempted to argue religious mania and inherited insanity from their defrocked father. Attorney Benjamin Cross presented evidence of Reverend Silas Penlow's heretical teachings and history of mental instability, suggesting his daughters were victims of indoctrination rather than willful criminals. He called witnesses who testified to the sisters' devotion to Scripture and their genuine belief in divine mandate for their actions. But the argument collapsed under weight of physical evidence and the sisters' own lucidity when describing their crimes. Martha's partial confession, read into court record, demonstrated clear understanding of social and legal consequences. Her statement that they concealed evidence proving consciousness of wrongdoing rather than delusional innocence. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Eliza was called to testify. 8 months pregnant and visibly deteriorating, she took the stand on June 14th and delivered a statement that shocked even hardened observers. Court transcripts record her words verbatim. "Men came of their will. We gave them comfort. The Lord asked their life for our seed." She described her beliefs without shame or remorse, explaining that local men were corrupted by war and sin, unsuitable fathers for the pure lineage prophesied by her father. Only travelers, she claimed, men untouched by community corruption, could provide appropriate essence for conceiving angel-born children. Her testimony lasted 3 hours, during which she detailed the theological framework justifying murder, violation of corpses, and infanticide when offspring proved imperfect. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as she spoke, her soft voice and gentle demeanor creating horrifying contrast with the depravity she described. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The verdict, recorded June 16, 1878, specified conviction for 4 murders with strong evidence suggesting additional victims beyond reasonable proof. Judge Pickett sentenced both women to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on September 12th of that year. His sentencing statement, preserved in court archives, declared that evil had hidden itself as healing, but that justice would tear away the mask. He noted that the sisters had betrayed not only their victims, but every person who had trusted them with their family's health and survival, weaponizing compassion and faith for purposes too dark to fully comprehend. The execution was carried out precisely as ordered. On September 12, 1878, at first light, Martha and Eliza Penlow were led to the gallows constructed in the courthouse square. Witnesses numbered over 300, including relatives of identified victims and citizens who demanded to see justice completed. Eliza, who had given birth weeks earlier to a stillborn infant with severe deformities, sang the hymn "Rock of Ages" until the trapdoor fell. Martha remained silent, her throat too damaged from the lye poisoning to speak, but her eyes showed no fear or remorse as the noose was placed. Both women died instantly, according to Dr. Albright's medical confirmation, their bodies left hanging for 1 hour as prescribed by law before being buried in unmarked graves outside consecrated ground. Sheriff Holloway's final report, filed September 13th, contained a single line that summarized the entire investigation. Evil hid itself as healing. God tore away the mask. By court order, the Penlow homestead was burned to its foundation 3 days after the execution, the fire watched by citizens who wanted every trace of corruption purged from their land. The property was declared cursed ground, forbidden for habitation or cultivation. Over 140 years later, locals still claim no grass grows where the smokehouse stood, that the earth itself rejected the evil that had soaked into it. A memorial erected near 11 Point River in 1879 bears the names of identified victims, ensuring they are remembered not as anonymous travelers, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose deaths demanded and received justice through law rather than vengeance